And so I remember as I was healing and I was getting all my emotions out and guttural cries were coming out of me. When he would nap, when my baby would nap, I would weep. I'd go in the playroom in the far corner where nobody could hear me, and I would be on my knees and I'd put a pillow for my knees because, postpartum still aches and pains a year or two after. And I'm gutter, like letting it all out. And I remember feeling like I was going to die, like the pain in my heart. And I said, Lord, I've never felt my physical heart break the way that I feel right now. And I almost feel like I can't breathe, like I'm going to die from suffocation from the pain.
Nicole, thank you so, so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Libby.
Of course. So I guess we will hop right in. And if you want to share your story.
Yeah, my journey, I call it a journey because that's what grief is really. But I would say that my loss started about 13 years ago, almost 13 years ago, when I was pregnant with my twins, Christian and Eve. And I remember being 4 months pregnant, and we were so excited. We had gone through the process of in vitro fertilization and going through that. And I remember there was just even grief for that, just walking through that, the story of motherhood that was not what we anticipated. You look in the movies a lot of times, which, the way that things are solved are sometimes so nice. It's in that shortened amount of time. And so I just somehow thought pregnancy would be easy, carrying would be easy, all of that. And when it didn't happen and we had to go through this process, I thought, well, you know what? Okay. Because we struggled, I'm sure it'll turn out okay. You believe that because there were other areas in your life that you struggled in, that this is the one thing that I was like, okay, we could do this. This is something that should be easy. And I remember there was male infertility involved, a miscarriage before then, on my end. And so needless to say, we really, we were in a rough spot, but yet excited. And then finally we go to this appointment and we're going to see the gender of the babies. It's 4 months. We're like, okay, we're over the moon. All of this heartache, all of the shots, all of the needles and the pain and the desire and the waiting. And here we are, and we have 2 babies. And so we were so excited. And I'll never forget, my husband was working. And so my mom came with me at the appointment, and he was a teacher. So it's not like it was easy for him to just leave. So my mom was with me, and we're just like, oh, this is going to be great. And I'll never forget the technician's face. And first she was laughing along. And I'm a pretty good, reader of just kind of like what people are thinking or feeling. I'm pretty intuitive. And so I remember looking and just seeing her go from like, woohoo, yeah. And I'm like, what is it? And her face, she just was stone. There was no response. She's like, excuse me, I have to get the doctor. And I looked at my mom, and we went from joking around and from her saying, oh, it's a boy and a girl, what a blessing, blah, blah, to now all of a sudden having a doctor come in with a straight face and do, one of these on the, on the machine. And I'm looking and I'm trying to, you can't really see much. I thought I could figure some things out. I couldn't. And I look and she says, we're going to have to do an amniocentesis. And I hate to say this, but based on what I'm seeing, just even visually, she's like, your daughter has the worst case of trisomy 13 that I've ever seen. And I didn't know what it was. And so, but I do recall that moment, and I'm like, trisomy 13, like, what are you talking about? Because when you go through in vitro, they called me, advanced maternal age at 34. And so anyway, that's a whole other podcast. I'll get there another day. So I said, we did they had to do the genetic testing. There was a 0% chance, not that anything would have changed. We would have accepted whatever, God blessed us with. But the point is they did it, and there was a 0% chance. And it ended up being what they called spontaneous, which means that there was a 0.0% chance that this should have happened. It was like 0 in a billion. And it just happened to be my daughter. And it happened to be this pregnancy. And it happened to be at this point. And I just remember driving home and my mother was next to me. And I was always grateful because we're very close. And she's like, oh, honey, maybe you should pull over. Maybe you should pull over, because what came out of me as I'm driving, I was in shock. And then this guttural cry that I don't think I ever had in my life until that moment emerged. And it's like a cry that comes from your soul. And it comes from this deep, deep place of everything that you thought would be. And now it's not. And that's where our grief journey began, in utero. Yeah.
Whenever they gave you that news, what was your reaction?
So after weeping, I had to tell my husband. And so I walk in the door and I'll never forget his face. He's excited. He comes in without seeing me first, and he's walking in and he closed the door. He's in his suit and he's like, hey, and he's just like, so, and he's like, and all of a sudden he was like, what's wrong? And I just began to sob and I barely got it out. And I said, she has trisomy 13. And I said, and you'll never guess what they told me. And he said, what? And I go, this doctor was very cold. And she goes, we suggest a partial reduction. And I said, I'm sorry, a what? And she's like, a partial reduction. I said, oh, you mean the euphemism for abortion? And she's like, yes. And I'm just like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to give God a chance. I believe that in miracles, and I just want to give God a chance to do whatever is meant to be. I want him to do that. I don't want to do that. And she said, well, we're not going to monitor her. And I looked and I said, let me be clear on this. I said, I'm nice, but I said, that's my baby and I'm her mother and she will be my baby until, whatever happens. But you will monitor her. I said, because you work for me. And if you can't do that, then I will find somebody else, but you will not skip her and pretend that she doesn't exist. And she goes, I'm concerned about your mental health because, we have mothers that are of maternal age that have twins, are at a higher risk of, depression, postpartum depression and things like that. And I said, I'm 4 months pregnant with twins that I waited for, that I prayed for, that I asked God for. And you want to I said, is it going to kill me to grow her? No. Is it going to harm my son? No. So then why are we doing this? Because of my mental health? And I said, no. I said, I became a mother upon conception. So as soon as those babies, they're our biological children, as soon as they took, they're ours. I said, they belong to us. That's my daughter, and she will be my daughter forever. No matter what, even if she goes to glory, she'll be my daughter. That doesn't end. And I want to know how she's doing. I need to know. I can't not know. And so finally they agreed. I relayed all of this conversation to my husband, and he said, what do we do now? And I said, now we pray. Now we pray. And we announced it because there were a lot of people who, were excited about the pregnancy. And so we announced it, and we had a global prayer movement over this little baby that were just praying for me, praying for our family, praying for our children, and praying that the Lord would do, that he would step in and heal her. And so that was what we were praying for. And we were just walking through each month. But I will say this, everything changed, Libby, in that moment. Meaning, how, you'll get excited over, the bridal shower when you get married, or you get excited over the baby shower. It felt like everything was tainted, that everything was painted with some grief. And it's a strange place when you realize that joy and grief can exist simultaneously. It's a deep recognition where in one hand you're excited, in the other hand you're hopeful, but yet still in the other hand you're grieving because you're of the unknown, of what could happen, of what they say will happen. And she had a cleft lip, a cleft palate, a hole in her brain, a hole in her heart, and underdeveloped lungs. And so each time we would go for a scan, and at that point I had to go weekly because my pregnancy became an at-risk pregnancy because of, the fact that I was having a very tough time physically carrying. I had edema, I had gestational diabetes. I was like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And so I had to be on bed rest and I had to get scanned every week because of the advanced maternal age. And so as they're scanning me, I remember them saying, oh, the hole in her heart disappeared. The hole in her brain closed. Her skull's complete now. So I was in my head now, I'm thinking, okay, that's great. We could always do surgery for cleft lip, cleft palate. Those things are not. And if there's developmental disabilities with trisomy 13, you know what? It doesn't matter. We're going to walk through it. That's our daughter. We're going to make it. We're strong. We're tough. We could do this. We could do hard things, right? And each month that went by, I was finally on bed rest. And then everything just completely exploded when it came time to birth.
During the pregnancy, you said that you did have some grief. Was it like an anticipatory grief?
Yeah, it was, but it was also a current grief because I felt like my story, I felt like I deserved better. I felt like my story, everything was so hard so that I deserved a happy pregnancy story. Like the way my friends, they just would think of it. They would be like, it's easy. I just think baby and I'm pregnant. And I'm over here like, really? That's great. Cause for me, and I felt like this was one thing in my life that shouldn't have been a battle because I've had a lot of battles in life. And I'm like, this shouldn't have been one. So I was grieving the fact that I needed to go on bed rest. I was grieving that I had kidney infections during pregnancy that were so painful. And my little guy was very active and they used to fight in the womb. So they would she would kick him, he would kick her. And I'm like, okay, you guys need to calm down because, mommy's kidneys hurt, and they'd kick. And so I would have to go on IV. I was in the hospital. It was not like this hunky-dory, me working out during my pregnancy like I thought, having the glowing hair and, being this beautiful pregnant woman. I was, my feet were so big, I couldn't even fit in shoes. I was just like, oh my gosh, nobody talks about this stuff, that you think of. And even sometimes in, I would say, movies that are inspirational movies, I love. For me, I get happy when it ends, which is why sometimes I really like a Hallmark movie. Sometimes I'm really in need of something that's tidy because a lot of times it's not like that. And so I was grieving what was going to happen, but I was also grieving what I thought I deserved. And I think that's where we can tend to go off the rails a little bit is when we look at the measure of our lives and we say, I think that it should have been easier, or I think that because I've gone through this, and that, this shouldn't have happened kind of thing. And it just doesn't work that way. It's not that. And so I was grieving just the fact that I was miserable during pregnancy because I was in so much pain. And also, and again, probably another podcast, but can I just say how the medical field likes to gaslight women and their pain. So I have I'm a very strong advocate for women in many ways, especially as a minister. But I am very just kind of like, let's stop gaslighting women's pain. Let's stop. Cause I remember a doctor, I have a very high pain tolerance. So for me to scream or, be real vocal it's just not my personality. And I'll never forget, Christian was kicking, the babies were kicking and I had a bad kidney infection that had gone untreated because they just weren't paying it. They were like, oh, pregnancy's hard. Oh, that's normal. The same gaslighting stuff as always. And so I remember I'm like, no, it's not. And they finally saw. And so I said to the doctor, please, I am in so much pain. And he went like this. Yeah, I know. We could all hear you down the hall. And I said, well, you're about to hear me again right now. And my husband's like, honey, wait. And I was just like, you're fired. I was like, get out. I'm like, get me somebody else, because you're minimizing the absolute agony that you have no idea, because you don't know what it's like. But I'm over here and my blood pressure is through the roof, and they're concerned because I'm having Braxton Hicks from the pressure of this pain. So I think that all of that combined led me to this haze where I felt robbed. I was like, Lord, I've been robbed. I've been robbed of this experience of what I thought it would be. And I've been robbed in just enjoying the moment. And then, of course, even childbirth was not what I thought it would be, because something very unexpected occurred right when I was supposed to be giving birth.
What happened?
Well,
I'm like,
well, I went to the bathroom, just normal. My husband helped me up. I was humongous. I used to be a size 0. And at that time, and I was, I think 125 soaking wet, at 5'5". And then I was 205 pounds to 210, all water, like all edema. I mean, when I walked, water would squish. That's how much it was so rough. And I just remember saying, oh, I have to pee again. I was always drinking ice. I was anemic. And so there I am. I'm just using the potty like a normal pregnant woman. And I noticed that I felt like it wasn't stopping. And I'm like, that's strange. And I felt this still small voice say, get iron pills. I looked down and I am hemorrhaging. And it was not like the water broke. No, it was hemorrhage between having bronchitis I had pneumonia, which they found out when I went in the hospital, kidneys, all of it. I started to lose blood, and I yelled for my husband, and I gripped the wall and I said, get me iron pills stat. And he ran to the kitchen because he was like, okay, calm down. I said, no, we don't have time for that. Here's what I need you to do. Go get this like stat. And he runs and he gets the iron pills, and I can't even tell you how much. I was lucky that I was just stable enough to be able to swallow these horse pills that were iron pills that I had for anemia. And I said, we don't have time for an ambulance. I have to go. And we wrapped ourselves in, like I was wrapped in, blankets, and because I was just not stopping. And he sped like the guy could be a race car driver. He was just like, like he got me to the hospital so quick. And even then they were like, oh, your water just broke. I said, my water didn't break. I am hemorrhaging. I was like, is somebody going to pay attention? Like, I could not believe. Libby, there were nurses everywhere. It was as if I didn't exist, and there's blood pooling on the floor. But what do I know, right? Because I just must be some hysterical pregnant woman. So I said to my husband, who's very kind, I said, I am about to be unkind. I said, so either somebody comes now, I said, or, and I just made a lot of stink. And sure enough, a doctor's like, what's this commotion? And he looked down and he's like, oh my gosh. He's like, you're hemorrhaging. I went, yes, I am. I said, and he goes, who left her here? He was so mad, this doctor. He was like, what on earth? He wheeled me back. He's like, you're in labor. You're hemorrhaging. Like, we need an emergency C-section stat. And I did not want a C-section. My hope was to have a vaginal delivery. And I felt like, great. Now, I'm losing blood and feel like I'm dying. And I remember they couldn't get the spinal tap right. They had to stick me about 3 or 4 times while I'm on the table, in my spine, and I'm like just hemorrhaging. And I'll never forget, they laid me out on the table, and I was so cold because I lost blood that I was like, I was shaking. I was doing that like shaking thing. And I saw the doctor's face, and it was just such a somber moment, because this was the hospital where, I was planned on giving birth, but it didn't matter. There was a team of OBGYNs, and this one particular lady happened to be there who had visited before, and she was very stern. And I was just glad that the other doctor who was monitoring wasn't there, because I don't think I could bear to see her face. But there was a team, and so I was familiar with this doctor who was on call, who was going to deliver my babies. And her face, she didn't smile, nothing. It was just immediately, there was a sheet, and I heard the rushing. And I remember saying, I'm not numb yet. I was like, wait, I'm not numb yet. So they quickly, and the next thing you know, I remember going up. I remember this feeling of life draining from me. And I started to go up to the ceiling. Like I felt like I was floating away, and there was light. And I felt like, oh, this is peaceful. Like where this was headed was a peaceful space. I don't even remember my husband next to me. I just remember peace until this. And this was the first time that I heard the audible voice of God, like in my ear, the way that I hear you. And it was the first time I've ever heard of it audibly. In the past, I've heard, in your heart, all of that, you pray, you hear. But this was, and I heard wake up and fight. And it was as if somebody took paddles and put it on me, but they didn't in real life. But in the feeling of it was like, zzz, like the way that I came back, I jolted into myself again. And I looked around and I kept saying, is she healed? Is she healed? Because they weren't bringing Eve to me. As this is all happening, they were not bringing my daughter. And my husband didn't want to tell me. And he said later on, I didn't want to tell you because I thought you would let go. I thought if you knew that she wasn't healed, that you would just let go. And I was so scared. He goes, I really believed that I was going to be walking out of there alone, wifeless and childless, because the babies were in severe danger as well. And so I remember when he said no, they brought me Christian right away, and they showed me his face, and he was fine. And I couldn't even hold her. They immediately had to do a blood transfusion. And so they wheel me back. The babies are, getting cleaned up. I don't even recall the trip back to wherever the room was. But I do recall the fact that I'll never forget this part. I got up to go, believe it or not, I went to I had to go to the bathroom. And I'm just such a strange bird. I don't know how. I just picked myself up, and there was a doctor that walked in, and he was like, we're about to give you your blood transfusion. And he dropped the clipboard and he goes, you're standing. And I said, yes. And he said, why? I said, because I have to go to the bathroom and there's nobody in here. He goes, you lost half the blood in your body. You shouldn't be conscious. He goes, you should be half out of it. I'm coming in here to tell you we're giving you your blood transfusion and you're holding onto the wall to use the bathroom. And I said to him, hey, when you gotta go, you gotta go. And I'm just like this, just humor, because that's what you have in that moment. And, he called the nurses in, he says, no, we're doing catheter, whatever it was. And so then immediately I'm getting a blood transfusion. At the same time as you see blood transfusion happening and I'm laying in the bed, half out of it, they wheel in Eve. And she's hooked up to, wires and things. And I'll never forget the paramedics' face, because they said, we're not equipped to deal with her condition. The NICU is not ready for this. So we have to send her down to Westchester Medical. And they're like, you can't go with her. So they were not going to life flight her, but emergency ambulance ride down, because I said, can I hold her? They said, no. There was this little hole, like right in the plastic thing that she was in. And I was able to put my finger there, and there was just her little finger. And I touched her little finger and her cheek. That was the only contact I had with her. That was it. She was whisked away, and I remember seeing their face, the ambulance workers, the paramedics. They were like, these two gentlemen, like, were crying because they saw, like, they just knew the story because it was everywhere, in the wing. Like, this is such a tragedy, da da da. And so Christian was in the nursery. They were giving me a blood transfusion. I had no time to hold my baby, to say goodbye, nothing. And I was not stable enough to go with her. The day later, after that birth, because they were born on the 28th of February, the next thing you know, I'm on the phone and I'm like, how is, my husband's driving back and forth. We lived an hour away from Westchester. So now he's driving all the way downstate. Family that lives in Westchester is visiting her. They're not allowed to touch her, but they're able to pray and they're able to see her more than I couldn't even see her. And they're there being able to see her and pray and all of that. And my husband's driving back and forth to be there for me and Christian, but then also be there for Eve. And the next thing you know, they tell me, we have to send Christian down to Westchester. And I'm saying, are you serious? Why? There's blood in his stool. They then immediately send an ambulance down with my son. So now I'm in a maternity ward and I am childless. And I am hearing the giggles and cries of new mommies with their little babies. And here I am with IV fluids, pneumonia, by the way, because the breathing specialist came in. He's like, I don't know how you're alive. He's like, we need, like, your lungs are crackling. So they had to check on me and wake me up and give me oxygen and give me medication, antibiotics, IV fluids, blood transfusion, you name it. I mean, I was a mess, an absolute mess. And I was babyless. So mentally, I was just stunned. Meanwhile, the doctors are calling and they're saying, your daughter Eve is struggling. Please sign the do not resuscitate. Yeah. And I said, I can't do that. And they said, why not? And I said, because I have to give her every chance. You have to understand that in our belief system, I have to, as a mother, I have to give her every chance. And they said, well, she's suffering and that's your fault. You're choosing her suffering. Yeah, this is exactly, it's amazing. I said, I've never really met so many people that want me to kill my child all at once in such a small amount of time. I find it intriguing. I'm like, wow, that's intriguing. And so I said, no, this is what's going to happen. And my husband was also on the phone and Eve was making it. She made it. She's making it, but she's struggling. And I said to the Lord, I remember in that moment, that hospital bed, I said, I can't take this anymore. I can't do this, Lord. I cannot. I feel like a horrible mother making her suffer. So either two things need to happen. Either you heal her or you take her home with you, because I'm trying to do the right thing here and give her every opportunity and to try to give you every opportunity. But I'm feeling like this is torturous to her now. They've resuscitated her now several times. You got to do something. And then a phone call came. My husband happened to be on the phone with our mortgage company because I was so sick during the pregnancy and our home started the foreclosure proceedings at the same time. So the bank is on the phone with my husband and he's like, listen, we've just had the last 2 weeks and we will absolutely get caught up and all of that. But please, our daughter they said, we don't care about whether or not your daughter is dying. That's not our problem. And so needless to say, the Lord worked that out and we kept our home and all of that. And that was a miraculous story in and of itself. But I will never forget, he goes, hold on a minute. And the phone beeps and he goes, hello. And his face drops Meanwhile, he had handed me a cup of coffee from the hospital because now I was allowed to drink coffee. So I was like, that's my one thing, right? And I'm sitting there and I had just had this hot cup of coffee and I sipped it and he walked over and he took it away. And I joked around, just our relationship, you know, we're kind of funny people. And so I was just like, okay, so that was dangerous of you. You just took away my coffee, you know? And he looked at me and he goes, and he put it away. I said, what is it? I said, what is it? Just tell me, what is it? And he goes, Eve. He's like, she didn't make it, honey. She passed on. And I said, no, she didn't. I said, no. And he goes, yes, honey, she did. I said, nope, no. I said, well, guess what? It doesn't matter because if God could raise Lazarus from the dead, guess what? God could do this for her too. I said, so that's not a problem. I said, he'll do it. He'll do it. And I just kept saying that. And he's nodding his head and he's like, we could certainly pray, you know, for that. But he held off because they wanted to talk to me immediately about what do we do with the body. And I'm just like, so my husband held them off for 3 days. I said, give me 3 days, just 3 days. Please give me 3 days. That's how long, even 4, you know, Lazarus was raised on the 4th day. Just give me a couple of days. Let me just see. I need some time. And so here I am still in the hospital and I'm praying and I'm like, Lord, and the Lord said, honey, mm-mm. And I said, I'm sorry, what? So I just felt like, okay, I'm still going to wait. And by that 3rd or 4th date, I did get in contact with somebody and we had to make preparations. And so meanwhile, my son was in Westchester for a day or so, and they figured out that what the blood in his stool was not internal bleeding. It was him swallowing the hemorrhage. And so needless to say, he ends up being driven back. My husband picks him up as a newborn. He's discharged and I get to take him home 3 to 4 days after giving birth. And I'll never forget the nurse comes in and she's like, congratulations on your twins. And there's a pink balloon and a blue balloon and another nurse stops her and says, and I hear this like fevered whispering outside the hospital door, you know, and I hear like dead and her baby died. Like, no. And the other nurse quickly grabbed the pink balloon and I'm trying to just like not lose it completely and just emotionally lose it. And she's like, here's your blue balloon. Congratulations on your son. And I said, you know, I had twins. And I kind of said it under my breath, kind of like already she's being erased. Like already I'm getting this message that says, pretend she never existed and you'll be fine. And you know, that nonsense. And I couldn't do that. And so there I am. My husband's wheeling me out. He's carrying my son. I'm there with like a mask on because I have pneumonia and I don't want to get my baby sick. Forget breastfeeding. The lactation consultants were trying to knock on my door and my husband blocked the door and he's like, don't go in there. And he's like, she has no milk. She has pneumonia. She's on steroids and she lost half the blood in her body. And they're like, well, we could, and he's like, she can't feel like a failure over anything else right now. Leave her alone. And they were just kind of like, okay, you know, and they backed off because nothing was happening. Obviously, you know, my body, I nearly died. Like, I mean, I went up, I was on all these drugs, blood transfusion, like nothing was coming in. There was nothing there. Actually, it's crazy, but nothing ever came in. It was the stress of everything was so much so. And so there I am with my one blue balloon and I'm in a daze because I'm sick. I go home. Of course, everything's a disaster because it had to be. My husband was living out of his car. So everything's a disaster. He made sure that he, you know, did whatever he could on his way back and forth from my hospital to Westchester, back to the house, and setting everything up. And there I am. And I'm thinking, I can't, like, this is not my house anymore. Like everything just felt like this is my reality. Like I have to plan a funeral and I have a newborn who's screaming. And I then had to go 2 days later to get checked. You know, they want to check you. I remember walking in and my mother was with me and she was, you know, having I walked in and I see this OBGYN who is delivered. And she was the straight-faced one. And I remember thinking to myself, like, she was the one who didn't smile during the C-section because everything was so serious. So she was like, how are you? And she was such a beautiful woman too, like just, you know, just so regal in her and gentle. And her face actually held compassion. And she went from being like this during the time to weeping. And she went, you're the strongest woman I know. And she began to hug me. And I said, I don't feel that way. And she goes, well, you don't understand because you didn't see the miracle. And I said, what miracle? Because I remember when the doctor came in, he's like, how are you standing? And I said, his name is Jesus. So I remember when she said, there's a miracle, my ears perked up and I'm thinking, well, what miracle could there be? My daughter passed away and, you know, I'm, you know, sick. So where was this miracle? She said, Nicole, I thought we were going to lose all of you. She said, you bled so much that I really thought that your husband was going to go home alone. She said, we almost lost Christian if it wasn't for what Eve did. And I said, I don't understand. And she says, I've never seen this. She says, I know that this might not make sense, but I've never seen this happen. But your daughter, trisomy babies, first of all, she goes, never make it very long in utero. They often pass away in the womb. It's rare that they go to term. Trisomy 18, which is Down syndrome, things like that, that's different. But trisomy 13 is, she goes, especially the case that your daughter had, her lungs were not developed. She's like, and she couldn't survive. She said, but when you were hemorrhaging, there was so much blood in your cavity that your daughter spooned your son. Not only did she move, she spooned him and her hand went around his mouth and she blocked and took the brunt of the blood, which is how there was only a small amount in his stool. She said he was choking. Everything was such a mess in utero. And she's like, of course we don't know the exact science of how and what, but it was a miracle. That's what I know. And it saved his life. He wouldn't be here. And so I realized in that moment, wow. And I took that with me, but it didn't resonate because I did not feel miraculous. I felt like a broken woman who lost the child that she prayed for, the children that she prayed for. And I felt so bitter about it and I didn't want to deal with it. And I was dealing with a colicky son. And so I'm trying to plan a funeral and be a new mom, heal from pneumonia in an emergency C-section, and deal with the damage, essentially, that was done to my body because of it. And I just remember not resonating until later. I couldn't even tell you when the healing really began, except maybe it was when Christian was older, probably like 1 to 2, maybe even. And I was folding, he still was in onesies, so he had to be smaller. And I was folding laundry, the little baby clothes. And I remember feeling the Lord just kind of impress on my heart to share how I was feeling. And I felt him say, are you mad at me? How do you feel? And I said, I'm fine. With a little attitude. I'm fine. And in my head, I was like you care. Meanwhile, I was raised in the faith and I was faithful, and served the Lord, but I was angry. And I think that in church, a lot of times they don't teach you how to grieve. They don't teach you how to feel your emotions, and they don't let it be known that it's okay to be mad at God, that he can handle it just like you would get mad at anybody else with any kind of relationship that you have. You could be mad. And so finally, I threw the onesies down that I just did. And I was like, you want to know how I feel? And I yelled at the top of my lungs and I said, how could you? And he's like, now we're getting somewhere. And I felt I walked through, and as I walked through the journey of grief, I had to release the way that I thought it should go. If you look at it, I'm like, was technically my daughter is running free and happy. Yeah, she is. She is. But that didn't mean that it erases. And at her memorial service, the worst people were the church people. And I love God and I love church and I love church people. But I'm telling you, some of the stuff like, oh, she's in a better place. And she's dancing with so-and-so now, and all these like little hunky-dory things. And I just was like, the shortest verse in the Bible, which is the most powerful, is Jesus wept. And he wept knowing that he was going to raise Lazarus. So the way I look at it is, if he cried because he had compassion for his friends around him, not because they lacked faith like is taught, but because he actually had compassion, he wept with those who wept. And if he could do that, then why are we trying to make people feel better about their suffering? Let them feel it. So nothing's going to make it better. And so I said, at some point you have to realize that you're saying these things to make you feel better, but it's not making me feel better. And then furthermore, the second thing that I encountered in this journey of grief was comforting other people about my grief. So I'm like, how did that happen? I'm on the phone, and when you're the strong one, people will lean on you, and they're telling me about their feelings, and I am finding myself comforting them. And it was brutal. So I said, you know what? That's why I stepped back, and I said, I need to get all of this out with the Lord, because there's so much swirling. There's offense. I was offended at him. I was offended at people that said silly things. And I remember my pastor at the time said, honey, he's like, listen, you just have to understand people are stupid. And I said, that should be a scripture. And so we kind of laughed a little bit about that. And he's like, it's just, they don't know what to say. And so I learned how to have grace for that. But I recognized that there was the same people that said, I'll be there. It's like, if you don't get over it within a month or two, and you're grieving for a year or two or three, people don't know what to do. They don't know how to come alongside you on a journey that's long. They know the circumstantial, they know the cute things to say, that they could go like this, but they don't know how to walk alongside. And so I remember as I was healing and I was getting all my emotions out, and guttural cries were coming out of me. When he would nap, when my baby would nap, I would weep. I'd go in the playroom in the far corner where nobody could hear me, and I would be on my knees, and I'd put a pillow for my knees, because, postpartum still aches and pains a year or two after. And I'm gutter, like letting it all out. And I remember feeling like I was going to die, like the pain in my heart. And I said, Lord, I've never felt my physical heart break the way that I feel right now. And I almost feel like I can't breathe, like I'm going to die from suffocation from the pain. And I can't see my way out. Because, we had family that, wanted a headstone, and we didn't want that. Chris and I decided that we were going to do cremation. We felt like that was easier. I didn't want a stone. There was a beautiful little girl statue that my mother bought at a garden center, and she said, wherever you want to put it, honey. And I put it by this tree, and I'll never forget, because it was a tree that the landscaper told me was dead and that I should get rid of. And I said, no, give it a chance to bloom. And when we planted that little statue there, it began to bloom. It started blooming again. They couldn't figure it out. They looked and they said, the roots are all up. It shouldn't bloom. It makes no sense. It's dead, but it's blooming. And I just felt like that was God just giving me a sign to say, I see your pain. And I have a picture on my first Mother's Day where I'm standing there in my postpartum body with my infant. And that was a whole other thing. Like, you know, I felt like a melted candle. I was like, oh my gosh, like I am not the same woman that I was. And I just remember holding Christian next and then having my hand on like the statue. And that was what I had. That was it. And I remember there was a lock of her hair, and they give you pictures, you know, of like a ministry they do like after her death. But I couldn't look at them because she was gone and it was obvious. I can't explain it, but I almost would rather, there was one picture of her that was pink, even though you could see her cleft lip, palate, and abnormalities. I didn't care. That was life. But these other pictures, they were staged and they were death. And I couldn't even bear to look at it. Sometimes I would hold her lock of hair and just do this and grieve. And there came a point where the Lord said, you got to get rid of those things because that's impeding. And it was impeding because I kept obsessing and I had her nursery set up in yellow and ladybugs because I was not going to do like the typical girl thing. Because I was like, if she's anything like me, she's probably, you know, going to be climbing walls and like scaling mountains because, you know. And so I was like, if that would be my daughter. And so I got her, you know, something more neutral, like ladybugs and cute little things. And it stayed there for 2 months, 3 months. It took a long time for me to take her crib down to donate her clothes because there was faith. I had to return 2 of everything, her car seat, her bouncy, her crib, her bedding, everything. And I just felt like that room was a marker of what I looked at as a failure. So I was grieving the loss of my daughter, but I was also grieving the loss of a story. I was grieving what should have been. I was grieving even every birthday that there should have been a little girl next to him singing happy birthday. And it was like that for a few years until I began to notice not that she was ever forgotten, but that I could breathe again. There comes a moment, and and I wish people understood that it's not like there's not a time limit on it. Like people have to stop. Like I remember, you know, some people even were like, you need to get over it. And I'm just like, you who have never lost a child telling me to get over it. Like, and that was like in year 1. And I'm over here like, you know, the lack of understanding. And I remember saying this to somebody. I said, you know, grief is not a lack of faith. It's the price of love. And if you don't get that, then you really don't get the heart of Jesus and you don't get, you know, any of that, you know, because these were people who, you know, knew him. So I'm like, if you're saying that, then you know him in theory, but really not relationally, because that's the most powerful thing you could do is cry alongside somebody and just sit with them. Sometimes it's just holding their hand. It's not even saying, hey, if you need anything, get back to me. Sometimes it's like, I'm dropping off groceries and bye. That's it. Not like I have to visit you, right? Just not like you have to sit and entertain somebody else, but like, hey, here's some food. Hey, here. And it was lonely, Libby. It was lonely. Have you found that like with loss, how, you know, it seems that everybody kind of wants you to get over it and like expects you to move past quickly, and
yes,
they don't get that it takes time?
No one that had not lost someone, they did not understand. And a lot of those people kind of drifted away very, very quickly. And even the people that did understand, it still is incredibly lonely. And it was. I also got a lot of it will get better and like you have to move on and all, and you don't move on. And I do agree with you. There is like a moment where you start breathing again. And I had read this quote, and it was something along the lines of, whenever I see my loved one again, I don't want to tell them I died when they did.
Ooh, that's good. Wow.
And that changed my perspective. It still hurts all the time. Yeah. But I want to kind of live for her and help people. You had said whenever the nurse realized that you had lost Eve, she didn't even mention it.
Right.
That is crazy to me and so real. Like, she did not even acknowledge your loss.
No. It sends a message. It sends a message that, as if you could pretend that this living person that you grew and that was a part of you. And I think this is true with any loss. It's a part of you. Relationships, it's a part of you. And it was as if I was expected to pretend. And I remember one person even said this, and I hate to say it, but I have to, because I think that it's important that others understand that it's not just them. They're not crazy. People really don't know what to say. But I remember a person said, well, I lost my child at 5 or 6 years old. And so it's different. I've experienced more grief because I had them in my life for 6 years. Whereas you didn't really know your baby.
But some would argue that no grief is like worse than another, like we all experience it differently and every grief is valid. But some people would argue that your grief is worse because you never had time with Eve.
That's an excellent point. And so I'm like, well, this isn't a comparison. And in fact,
right.
I used to tell people, because as a minister, when they heard my story, because I didn't minister at that time, but years later, when they found out that I had a loss and I began to share my story, and I wrote a devotional book all about grief, about how to grow through grief. And I just channeled all of that into this book, because that's what I started doing. I started writing, and I started writing devotionals, and like deep, not like the little cutesy, girl paragraph stuff, but the kind of like meaty, hard stuff that people don't usually want to talk about. And I'm like, that's where I go to. I like to go to the places that nobody wants to go, because there are people there. There are people there. And so when people would say to me, well, I've never experienced, I lost for example, they lost a parent, or they lost a sister, or they lost a spouse. And they're like, well, it's not like with you. And I'm just like, no, stop right there. They're like, yours is worse. No, don't do that to yourself. And they're like, what? And I'm like, don't minimize your grief in the face of mine. Because here's the thing. Grief is just a mirror. Like, you're hurt, I hurt with you. Whether I lost or not, you did. And this isn't about me. This is me ministering to you, I would tell them. So me saying I understand loss is not comparing. I didn't bring up this story, but when they asked, well, what happened? And they were like, whoa. And I'm like, no, that doesn't mean that's not like, that doesn't disqualify your pain. And I feel like we need to be better about saying, hey, together, you understand pain, I understand pain. And that's that. The stories are different, but pain is pain. Loss is loss. And the thing about loss is you often find this strength to carry on. And it starts with second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour. Then all of a sudden it's day by day. And I remember saying to the Lord, I'm scared. And the Lord said, why is that? And I remember feeling in my heart, like, what if I forget her? Like, if I don't say her name, I wanted someone to say her name. Nobody said her name. And I'm like, please, I just want to hear her name. And I remember when I took Christian to the doctor, his first, visit and check, and they said, okay, we're supposed to see Eve and Christian. Where's Eve? And I said, well, she didn't make it. And they're like, And it was almost like they wanted to over, and I'm like, listen, you can say, I remember I just said, you could say her name, because grief is not something you get over. Grief is something you go through. And it's really kind of like, I liken it to, the Red Sea moment. There's not a bridge over it. You got to walk through, and you got to look up and see those big waves, and they can crash in on you anytime, and you're trusting that you're going to get to that other side. That's what you have in that moment. There's no boat. There's no oars. There's you, and there's grief, and there's God. And that's what you have. And you have to walk through it, and now I'm trying to get up and raise my child. So I'm laughing because he's hilarious and he's a baby, and I'm like, oh, my baby. But then I'm weeping when he naps, and it's like this roller coaster. And all I can say is, it's a crazy ride, but you get to the point. There was a point where I stopped seeing her next to him. There was a point where he became my child. And I remember her, and I will always on the birthday say, happy birthday, baby. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Mommy loves you. Or I'll pray and I'll say, Lord, just tell her happy birthday for me, in prayer time. And every Mother's Day for the last, my son's going to be 13. There's a ladybug. Whether I'm in New York, I live in South Carolina now. I live in Myrtle Beach, and I'm originally from New York. And even on the beach, there will be a ladybug that lands on my hand every Mother's Day for the last 13 years. There's not been one year, and ladybugs were her bedding. That was her bedding. It was like the lime green with the little red ladybugs on it. And I just know that that's a God wink, what I call it. And that's just a way of acknowledging, and I'm grateful. And I say, thank you, Lord, for the one. And then after that loss, because of the trauma of the childbirth, I actually developed an autoimmune disease called secondary Addison's disease, because my adrenals burnt out during childbirth. And so I remember meeting with an endocrinologist. I was really sick my son's first year of life. He was about maybe 14 months old, and I was in the hospital, and my organs were shutting down. And there we are again in this moment. And I just felt so triggered. I felt so triggered because it looked just like the maternity room. And I just remember feeling alone because, my mother would visit, of course, be with me, but my son had to take care of, my son and husband had to be together. He had to care for him. And we didn't have, much family other than, my mom and dad. And so they were doing quite a bit, driving me and helping and all of that. But I was in this hospital. Thank God there was an endocrinologist, and he figured out what was wrong at that last moment when they were going to try to do exploratory surgery. And I just knew I was going to die. I was like, Lord, I'm dying. If you want me to live, I need to live for my son. Then you need to heal me. And he sent someone in, and there's this doctor, and he's like, you have Addison's disease. He gave me steroids. I was home that day after being in the hospital for 2 to 3 days. I was home that day. So then came learning that disease and that journey. And there was a host of other conditions that came along with it that I was incrementally healed from over the course of 13 years. But when that doctor sat down and said to me, I know that you did IVF and that you have these embryos that you want to carry, but Nicole, you can no longer carry children. You won't make it. And so now I'm dealing with, okay, so not only do I not have my daughter, but I can't bear children anymore. And that was another layer of grief of having to walk through, because then people would be like, oh, do you just have the one? Do you just, because, again, women's reproductive, systems are topics of conversation in grocery stores, I guess. So I'm like, okay. I remember finally I had it because I just was coming off of that, and I was taking my little guy to the grocery store, and I'm kind of like limping along because, again, just in chronic pain. And, you know, a lady's like, you need to get that boy a sibling, somebody said, just out loud. And I said, I did, but she died. I said, you know, and like, I was like, I was not gracious. I was like,
no. Listen, I was at the grocery store very soon after my mom died, and it was a bad day. And I was snappy with someone, and they said something like, your mother didn't teach you any manners. And I was like, she just died. And I like yelled it. People have no idea what you're going through, and they are so quick to judge or like say something like, when are you going to get him a sibling? Like, what?
Isn't it amazing the lack of understanding? And you know, you yell it out because you're just like, you've had it. And really, it's because there's been those things building up, and finally you're done. And her face, she was like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And then I just kind of said, let's do better. And I looked around the grocery store. I'm like, let's do better, and let's not let strangers comment on our reproductive rights and in the sense of like what our family planning is what I'm saying. Like, I don't need to tell you stranger, you know, you can't touch a pregnant woman's belly in public. Like, it's not public property. Let's be tender towards like what somebody might be going through. And so I finally just started leading with the truth. If somebody was like, oh, well, you know, is that your only one? And I'm like, well, there's one in heaven. Actually, there's a few in heaven, but we're grateful. Like, that just shut it right up, because I'm like, if you're going to be nosy enough to ask, then I'm going to share. And so I just kind of learned how to, you know, take that approach. But after that, not having, like, losing a child and then not being able to have anymore, I said, well, Lord, like, what do I do with these embryos? I didn't want to donate it to science. I didn't want to, you know, again. So all of a sudden I'm writing and I'm editing, and I was editing for a magazine, you know, and writing an article and, you know, doing this whole like publishing thing and editing and all of that. And this thing just pops on my screen, and it says, you know, it was a Christian embryo adoption aid. Like, I've never heard of that. I'm like, wait, what? And it popped on the screen, and I X'd out, and then it popped on again. And I'm like, what? And I X'd out, and I knew what it was, because I said, maybe the Lord will heal me in the next couple of years and I'll be able to have it. Well, after 5 years, they hold those embryos. My son was 5. At that point, we were either going to pay or we were going to donate, and we had to figure out which. And I wanted to do a surrogate. So I was, you know, I had a really close friend who was like, I will carry this baby. Like, pregnancy is easy. I have 6 kids. She's like, you know, I will do this for you. Let's pray on it. So she prayed separately. I prayed separately, and I knew the answer. I could just feel it. And so I got on the phone and I'm like, hey, she's like, you too? And I'm like, yeah. And we came to that agreement that was not the way. So I was ignoring those little pop-ups. I'm like, nope. I was like, let me get this straight. This is real. Like, this is why I share it like this, because people think that if you're, you know, have a certain kind of profession, like if you're a psychologist or if you're a minister or a pastor or whatever, that you don't have these feelings. And I remember clearly saying, so my pregnancy was horrible. I lost a child. I gained a disease and a couple of other diseases, which thank God I don't have today. I mean, I still have Addison's, but the other things are healed. Thank God for that. I am definitely a walking miracle. But I'm like, what? Now I can't have a surrogate. And now you are asking me to bless another woman with my biological babies, my husband and I, like our babies. That's what you're asking us to do. And the answer was yes. Yes, I am. And I fought, I wrestled, and then I realized, okay. And it was this beautiful process of filling out, you know, pictures, paperwork, and people submit applications. It's very like on the up and up. It's done with honor and love. and beauty and all of that. And I remember not wanting to like the couple that submitted, but they were just so young. They were at that point, I mean, I was 40, and they're in their late 20s, early 30s. And I remember being where they were. And I was like, and I knew. And so we donated, and we had an open adoption where I get to see pictures, and others, the other babies went to be with Jesus, but there was one, and a nice, wild, curly haired, crazy little girl. And I get to see her from afar, in the sense of pictures that we exchange, and we pray for each other and things like that. And she knows that there was somebody who, sacrificed so she could be here, and they did a wonderful job. Great people. And, she entered kindergarten, and it's bittersweet. For the first year, I wept every time there was an update. But to see that there was life, even though I couldn't carry, to see that there was that. And it was such a crazy, crazy story, that there was layers of loss, there was layers of grief, but yet there were layers of healing. And I was able to actually bless somebody with what they couldn't do for themselves. And it felt like that moment where, I don't remember if it's Solomon who, where the real mother says, no, give the baby to her, and the other mother's like, yeah, we could cut the baby in half, no problem. And you knew who the real mother was. I kind of felt like the woman who was like, this is the right thing to do. It's better to do it this way. I don't want to be the person that says, if I can't have them, nobody can. They deserve a shot at life. And if I truly believe that, then I'll do this. You see? And if I don't believe it, then I'll be selfish and just leave them there forever, or, pretend it doesn't exist. And I just simply couldn't do that. I couldn't. And so there was that part. And it felt like there was all of this, that I had to walk through, and that my husband and I together relationally had to go through, because nobody ever tells you that you grieve differently. And that grief could, sometimes it was like I was grieving first. I was emoting, I would say, more first. And then when he was grieving, or when he started, I felt like, what are you doing? Where were you the whole time? And he was there, but he was the rock. But then and I just remember realizing, you know what, Nicole, you don't get to control how other people grieve. And it's not that you're going to be sucked back in because he just started the grieving process. Now you get to be the person. You get to be there for him the way he was there for you when you were walking through it. And I had to even release that. So there was just a lot. And I think that people don't get that about grief, that it's just more than just the person not there anymore. There's dynamics, family.
You had mentioned that you were, of course, grieving Eve when you were taking care of your son and being joyous with your son. Mm-hmm. Did you, because I felt a lot of guilt around my mom. It was different kinds of guilt, but did you experience any guilt being there for him?
100%. I felt guilt. You mean being there for Christian? Yes, I did. But I also blamed myself for her death. I think that was the hardest part for me, because there was a little bit of guilt when I would laugh a little too much, but not as much, more so that, did I do something wrong? Was it something I ate? Was it something I did? All of that and I think I blamed me, because it's easier. It's easier for women to blame themselves. They do this we do this in relationships too. It's easier to say, oh, well, it must be me, because what can you control? You. So if a problem is external and you have no control over it, that's scarier sometimes than actually walking through it. And so for me, the guilt was, I couldn't do this, or somehow I caused this, or, or I'm having too much fun with Christian. But I would say the part that was the scariest was the fact that during the day when I was with him and we would go to the park, I was so hyper vigilant about losing him. And that was the thing that I felt guilty over, because my guilt of not being able to save my daughter or hold her or even be there when she passed was manifesting itself through fear. So unresolved grief always leads to fear. It leads to anxiety. And so I kept picturing, I would picture him getting hit by a car in the parking lot. And panic. My heart rate would go up. I probably was post-traumatic stress, honestly. And I would picture him tripping over something, and I was hovering. I was so helicopter his first 2 years of life that somebody actually had to sit me down and say, you've made an idol of this boy. You're trying to be God in his life. You're so helicopter, you're so overwhelmed by, God forbid, he falls, or if he gets hurt, or, you're just so hyper vigilant all the time. She's like, it's not healthy, because it's not healthy for him, because he's going to learn how to be afraid of everything, but it's also not healthy for you. And I appreciated her for saying that, because he was 2 and 3 at the time, and she wasn't saying to get over the death. And at first I was upset. I'm not going to lie. It stung. I was just you're really going to tell me this after what? But then I realized, no, she knows already. She was a mother of older children, and she experienced loss and miscarriages, and she remembered walking through some of that fear herself. And what she was doing was not ignoring my grief, but saying, hey, don't let unresolved grief turn into anxiety and fear that prevents your son from living and exploring his environment, because he doesn't know any different. And that hit me hard. So guilt was more about losing and not being able to carry. And then as a result, it manifested in anxiety and fear. And then once I gave that and I said, I have to trust that I'm not God, and I'm not in control of my son, and that things happen. It was even at the playground, I was over him. Just, God forbid, he had one little, if he cried, I was, my baby, I wanted to, and really I was overcompensating for something that I felt I didn't do well the first time, which was bear babies. I felt like I failed, and I had to give that away. I had to release that, and then I had to release him. And, I think nobody tells you when you go through grief that sometimes your coping mechanisms are not going to be healthy. And it's not always food, or, and sometimes it's actually, you start to help people, you start to almost go in this other direction where you're trying to overcome what you've lost or replace it, but nothing can. You're trying to prevent what that loss was. You don't want it to happen again. And so because of that, you start to realize everybody else in your life that you love, and you don't want to lose them. So you're hyper aware. I started getting panicky about my husband getting in car accidents, and God forbid, something's going to happen to him. This loss, something was taken from me, and I can't deal with it anymore. I don't want to go through that again. And what it really came down to was at that point, I hadn't fully released my trust to God yet. I still felt like I had to be God in my son's life, because I felt like if you could allow Eve to be taken from me, if you could allow, this disease, if you could allow me to have to donate my babies to another woman, another couple, then what else will you allow? I felt like Job. And that's the root. And I always tell people that that's normal. You're going to start examining things that matter to you, people that matter to you in your life, and you're going to cling a little harder for a bit. Then you're going to eventually realize that if you try to play God, if you try to control your environment, whatever that looks like for you, some call it playing God, some call it whatever it is. But if you try to do that, that is a high burnout position.
Yeah. When my mom died, very similar. I found out my mom died through a phone call. So anytime the phone rang, I just knew someone died. I just knew someone died. If my boyfriend went somewhere and I did not hear from him within 10 minutes, I thought he died.
Yep.
And I tried to control everything around me. Everything.
Yes.
And I was in high survival mode.
I like that you said that. That is survival mode. Yeah. And here's the thing. It's hard to thrive when you're trying to survive. And I think we have to give ourselves grace, because I felt like I wasn't productive at all. and you can't be, and that's okay, but you are. It's just that it's not externally. There's just so much internal work that's being done. And I used to do the same thing, even with, my husband. I was like, text me when you get there. Where are you? Are you okay? If he was 20 minutes late, he's like, I just stopped at the store, I was just like, are you okay? God forbid, there was a fender bender or something. And so the phone became a trigger. For me, the world was a trigger because my kid was a runner, and he was like, he would break away from me and run in the parking lot, and cars are pulling out and I'm trying to run after him. And I just remember I started ordering groceries, because I was like, I can't do this. I was like, I'm ordering. And I said to my husband, because I remember I said, this kid is a runner. And I was so traumatized by it, because I would have to leave the cart and I was in physical pain. And, he just had no sense of safety. He had sensory processing and other things going on. And so I was dealing with that too and trying to manage it. And I said to my husband, either you go grocery shopping on the weekends or we're ordering, because I feel like every time I go out, he's going to get hit by a car in the parking lot. Much like when your phone rang, you were like, somebody's gone. Like I felt like this sense. I would wake up feeling dread, like a sense of dread, like waiting for something to happen in order to validate my belief that the other shoe has to drop, because you have something good in your life and you're looking at it and you're like, I have something good. And when something great has been taken from you, you worry about the other things that are good, right? You start to examine those things and they matter even more. And you tend to try to hold on tighter. And I realized I'm going to lose this kid, because if I don't let him go, I'm going to lose him. And I knew it. And I had to trust again. I had to learn how to trust. And I did. I couldn't even let my own husband take him somewhere without worrying, because I wasn't there. Because in my mind, if I was there, I'm mom. Like, that's my superpower. I can make it stop. Could I? No. But it's easier to believe that you can control it than it is to believe that you have no control. Because that's just heartbreaking in the face of loss.
It really is. And you had mentioned the blame. When my mom died, I definitely felt, later on, I felt guilt. I remember the first time I laughed, I felt so bad for laughing, and I immediately started crying. The first feelings that came, I blamed myself for her death. And so I didn't feel like I deserved to be happy, to have a good relationship with my boyfriend, to have any friends, to experience life. I was suicidal for a small amount of time, but it wasn't like I need to end myself. It was more like I don't deserve to have good experiences.
Yeah, punishing.
And yeah, I felt like I needed to punish myself for the death of my mom. So the blame is crazy. And it's just like our mind wants something to blame, I feel like. And it's not true. Our mind just has to have an answer.
And we look in. And I think as women especially, we look in. We look in and we do this, whether, people are in sometimes abusive relationships, they'll blame themselves because it's that same reason. It's I can't control. So it's easier. And I think that I had to forgive me. I had to forgive myself, even though I did nothing wrong. I had to forgive my body. And I went through this stage of forgiving myself, and I was like, body, I said, you did an amazing thing with what you had. And you're still alive and you're a walking miracle. And I had to speak life over myself because I felt such guilt that I couldn't enjoy any pleasure. And I looked at my body and I said, this body bore 2 children and it looks like it bore twins, but yet I feel like I paid for 2. Like I paid for my babies. I paid for the embryos, in my body. When I say paid, meaning I birthed, like I suffered for it. Like I gave myself to it, and it wasn't enough, which then turned into I wasn't enough. And then maybe I should have eaten this or not that, silly things. And we do that. And we do that when we lose parents, and we do that when we lose spouses, and we do that and we're like, oh, I wish my last conversation was this, or I wish, and we then start to go back on everything we did and everything we said because we have to pass some sort of exam in our own minds of being worthy of being happy again, as if we don't deserve joy. And I just held on to this one thing. He makes beauty from ashes. That's just what I kept saying to myself. And I looked around and I said, all I see are ashes. And I said, I just need to see beauty. And that's just why I just was writing these devotionals in my time that had a lot to do with grief, what people don't tell you, things like this. And I designed it because I had none of that. I went to a bookstore to look, and I looked and I was just like, I'm looking for something, and I'm not looking for self-help because like I already know like what the problem is, but I'm looking like I couldn't read those little, like the devotionals anymore that had like, the coffee and Jesus, like with the cutesy, like my life was not cute. Like it was no longer the same. I wasn't the same. So now I'm looking at some of these devotionals that were like this big with like a, here's your prayer starter kind of thing. And I'm broken on the floor. And I'm like, this isn't going to do it for me. And I couldn't find anything. So I started to actually write. In my Bible time, I began to just write and like say, this is the reality. Like this is how it feels. And this is what it is. And I began to just kind of gain insight and kind of some insight and revelation and wisdom as to like what was really happening, because nobody could tell me. Nobody knew how to support long term. And so that's where it came from. And sometimes in grief, Libby, we find that we become what we didn't have, right? Don't you see, like maybe not in the moment, but eventually. Like I look at this podcast that you have. When was this birthed?
After my mom died.
Right. It's heartbreaking, but good, believe it or not. And I say that with this face because it hurts when I say it. But that book, like it broke me. It broke me to start to write. I didn't want to publish it. I didn't want any part of it. I didn't even want to tell my story half the times. But what was birthed from it was something that would help somebody else. And I see that in you too. Just in general, I just see when you mentioned this loss and found, and I heard a little bit about your story and you shared so transparently. I just thought, look at her go. Look at her go. Like, look at what you've done, what you're building in memory. And it's a legacy, really. And it's beautiful and it's needed. And so
it is.
I just wanted to at least say that because this is hard. This is hard stuff. And you're doing it because here you are.
Thank you. I know how I felt early in my grief. And like I did come to a place where I felt like I could start living again, but I also still feel the pain and felt the pain when I started it. And I was like, I didn't have a resource like this. I didn't have anyone that understood. If I would have known of a podcast like this, I would have watched it in my bed by myself and sobbed and felt a connection.
Me too. Boy.
And so that's why I do feel like it's very important, and no one talks about it. And it's the one thing we are all going to experience in one way or another.
You're right. You're right. And these one-liners of like, hey, getting through it or hanging in there and all the things that we say.
Or when people are like, how are you? And I'm like, my mom died. When it's all like when I was heavy in it, I'm like, you don't even like you. No one gets it unless they have gone through it or they are going through it.
Yeah. And sometimes people forget, I notice. And that, boy, they forget. They forget what
they do.
I'm like, listen, I'm all for healing, but not ignoring or avoiding. And I try to tell people that unresolved trauma, you know, it will manifest in a multitude of ways if we're not careful. And so it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not feel okay. It's okay. And I tell them that because people will forget. And, you know, I remember somebody even saying, any better? And I'm like, no, she's still dead. Like, and again, I'm probably was snippy and sarcastic in my response, but I just felt like, what do you want from me? Like you want me to make you feel better about how I feel. That's really what it is. Like when people don't understand, that you're struggling in you're heavy in it. It's like, you know, like you said, you're like, my mom died. I'm like, my daughter passed. Like I'm not, it's okay to not be okay. And the fact that you need me to be okay doesn't mean I'm going to mask. I'm not going to mask to make you feel better about my grief. That's not going to happen. Because a lot of times that's really what people, they want to walk away feeling better about the way you're feeling. And that's just not okay. Like we can't do that and not be authentic, you know.
Or I feel like sometimes they want you to feel better so the relationship can be what they know, where like it can be a 50-50. Does that make sense? And that's not how relationships are either.
No, it's like, you're like, that's not it either. And I'm like, I know, you're right. It's not at all. Like, it really isn't. It is not. And that was where I had to not charge, you know, people for not grieving the way that I, you know, thought they would, or those close, you know, I had to understand that that the journeys are going to be different, but they're still a journey, and we still have to honor and respect, you know, each other and in that journey. And that, you know, there are days where, you know, he had to pretty much like lift me out of bed in the early times. And there was nothing 50-50 about that. But when it came time for him to grieve, the fear of being pulled back in was so great that I was like, why couldn't we have just grieved together? And then I was like, okay, Nicole, like, that's not how this works. Like, you know that. And I had to kind of sit myself down and just kind of like calm down and walk myself through and realize, you know, that's not how this goes. And just like he didn't say that to me, I need to make sure. So I began to just be quiet and allow him to share his grief and the fact that he was angry and, you know, at the Lord, like never blamed me, but just was angry and had to go through his own, you know, thing and how to walk through that. And I had to support him and not be all like, well, this is what I learned, you know, kind of thing. I had to just like let him feel and let him be. And we got through it. And I'll tell you, most people in marriages, I will tell you, when they lose a child, there is a high divorce rate in people who have loss. And I mean, we had gone through so much between physical illness, you know, and all of that. And it's been nearly 20 years and we're still going strong and super best friends and super, just loving towards each other. And I do count the fact that he is an amazing guy and that I'm super blessed. And just the fact that we didn't charge each other foolishly. We allowed each other space to be who we were and to grieve the way we wanted to. And the fact that God was that third strand in our marriage in particular really helped us because we really relied on that. We relied on allowing each other to be walking through our own healing so we wouldn't bleed on each other. Because that's inevitable when you avoid grief. It's going to bleed out. It'll reveal itself in every other area of your life if you're not careful. And so I knew that. And I was like, no, I don't want to be a statistic. We don't want to be a statistic. We're going to get through this, and whatever was meant for harm, we have a story. We have a miracle that occurred. We have a son that's alive. I'm alive. My doctor always tells me that I'm a walking miracle. She's like, I don't know how you travel, write, speak, do all the things that you do with this illness that says that you shouldn't, but here you are and you're okay. And it's like, I look back to where I was and I think I may not be where I want to be, but I'm not where I was either. And I think that when you're grieving, you have to set up what we call like a memorial stone. You have to set up these goals, like these places, and say, hey, I've overcome this. Like I went out of the house today and, I put makeup on. I remember, feeling so put together the first time I put makeup on after all of this stuff, or the first time that I actually was dressed in something other than sweatpants and spit up. And it felt like I was drowning in mess, motherhood, and grief. And when I emerged from the cave, the sun was still a little too bright. I still squinted a little bit, but there was a feeling of, okay, I'm standing now. I'm there, and each year and I say this carefully, because I wouldn't say each year it gets better. No, it doesn't. I would say that each year I'm more grateful. I'm more grateful for the fact that there was a miracle in utero that occurred, for the fact that my son lived, for the fact that I'm alive to see him grow up. I look and I say, okay, this is not the story that I wanted, but it's the story that I have. And I'm going to keep on writing. I'm not like the book is not finished, right? There's other chapters that I have yet to live. And that's what I have to look for, because if I look at any other way, it would be so easy to fall into despair. So there is hope beyond it. It just takes time. And I'll never forget her. That's my baby. I think of her every birthday's coming up. Her death day comes up on leap year every 4th year. And that was, something, because I, cry on the 29th when we have those leap years. I used to cry every year. Now I'll just shed a tear. It's not like this deep grieving cry. It's just like a kind of like, I miss you. I miss I would have loved to see who you are at 13, at 12, at 11 today, but I'll have to wait. But my hope and my joy is knowing that it's not an eternal separation. That's what I cling to. And the fact that my son is hilarious and he's got the same wit and sarcasm, God help him, that I do. God bless him. Poor kid. And I have joy there, and I'm actually able to be okay. And there came a point for him, because he used to ask, Mommy, I know I had a sister. When can I have another sister or brother? And I had to tell him, honey, that's up to God, because, Mommy can't and Daddy can't, whatever it was. And we shared that that's just really not possible physically right now. And there came a point when he was 10, because he used to ask every year, and I used to feel guilty over that I can't give that to him. And so I remember he said to me, Mom, I'm okay. And I said, what do you mean? And he's like, I'm good. I said, okay. And he's like, I know that I used to ask every year for a sibling. But Mom, like we've all gone to Disney World and we've done things that I know that we probably wouldn't have been able to do. And I have friends and I have a great family and I'm happy. Like I'm okay. And there was something about that released something in me that needed that closure. And it just kind of closed that door. It wasn't a slam shut like it felt, that grief. It felt like it slammed when I heard I couldn't have more kids. But now 10 years later, I heard it was a soft click. The door wasn't slamming shut. It was just a soft, like, okay, there's an acceptance. There's a, and that was 3 years ago. And so again, increments. Because it's never just us when we walk through grief. There's family members, there's other people involved. And boy, it's a lot. It's challenging. So, and I'm sure as well, just walking through some of those, through other people as well and how they're experiencing your loss. And it's insane. There's so many facets to it. So
there really is. What advice would you give someone going through a similar loss and grief that you experienced early in their journey?
I would say be patient with you. I would say understand that it's not something that you're going to get over. It's something that you're going to walk through and that it's not going to be as fast as you want it to be. And that's okay. It's okay. Like I look at people and sometimes I'll even, if it's in person, I grab their face and I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. And I just want to hug them and love on them because I know it. And I'm like, it's okay to grieve. You don't have to rush. You could be mad and you have to be patient with you. Self-care is important and it's necessary. Leave space for tears, leave space for feelings. And you don't have to be the strong one. You don't have to be. It's okay. You'll get there. But, how do we get back up, right? Squats, legs. When you do squats, you get stronger, because you're constantly getting up. And grief is a lot like that. Your legs will be able to stand again, even if they're collapsing right now. And that's okay. And just, I would say, be patient, be tender with you, and understand that it's not your fault. Look in the mirror, because I had to do this. I had to look in the mirror and I felt like it was Good Will Hunting all over again. And it was Robin Williams looking back at me saying, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And at first I was like, I know. And I kept hearing over and over again, it's not your fault. And then I broke down. And what came out was the lies that I was believing. And so I would say if you could just say that to yourself and see what comes out and journal it, because that will be that memorial stone that you could look back on and say, wow, I may not be in my grief journey where I want to be, but I'm not here, but wow, this was a tender moment. And it allows you to kind of look inside of yourself and gain a deeper insight even into who you are and to what has helped you. And maybe, just maybe, you can do what we have done, and that is make beauty from ashes.
I love that, Nicole. I feel like I could talk to you all day.
I feel like that about you.
I do. But I will end it for the sake of both of us. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. And I know that this is going to help so many people.
I'm so blessed. And I pray you feel better. And thank you for inviting me. I had a great time with you. And I know that, we're both overcoming sinus stuff. But you know what? It was great to talk to you because it was really beautiful to connect at this level too. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for watching Lost and Found. I really hope that this episode resonated with you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe below. There will be new episodes every Friday, and grief is hard and you don't have to do it alone. And I love you, and I hope I see you next time.